Well, hi, this is Joris Kaja in Riga again. I was kind of curiously surprised to see that some of my English speaking Facebook and YouTube or whatever friends had looked at a podcast, video podcast that I did yesterday in Latvian to talk about some local, sort of semi local issues. So I thought it was time to maybe sort of explain what that was all about. Basically, it is about the fact that there have been on Latvian social media and Twitter is a kind of weird place, some pretty heavy attacks by, I would say, a concentrated alt-right, extreme right, and even neo-Nazi contingent on liberals, or what they call liberasts, which is a curious amalgam of liberals and pederasts. Pederasts being a kind of nasty name for LGBT people, of course, who are also the object of hatred by this alt-right, extreme right, whatever you want to call it, contingent on Latvian Twitter. So what I basically said was that yes, there was this thing going on, and that I was one of the people who gets attacked, and there are a few other followers that I have who sort of believe in Western democratic open society values who also get part of the flack. But I've become kind of an icon for simply saying that maybe the Black Lives Matter have something to say, maybe the LGBT movement has something to say, and that should be listened to, and they should not be vilified the way they are sometimes on Latvian social media. Anyway, then another issue that I talked about was a claim that I was somehow an advocate of armed violence or violence of any kind. Well, how did that start? That started when on Facebook, in response to a post about anti-gay, anti-LGBT attacks and violence, I said that maybe one should conduct a thought experiment of what it would feel like to have a loaded weapon pointed at your head for 2 minutes. That would be a pretty terrifying experience. And then, when the weapon was taken away, it would be all over. And that terrifying experience is probably what people from the LGBT community and maybe people of color in other countries, not so much in Latvia, there aren't too many of them here, would experience over a lifetime in somewhat more diluted form. Except for them, nobody would ever pull the gun away. That is what you go through life with as a LGBT or other despised minority person here in Latvia. And that immediately then was deliberately distorted as saying that I was advocating, like pointing guns at people or something like, which I have not. In fact, the last time that I have fired a firearm was sometime in the late 1990s when I met somebody who was on his way to shoot with his Glock pistol, and I had my little son. My little son is now like 30 plus years old, but my number two, my second oldest son, was with me, and we went down to a firing range in the basement, and I got off about 3 or 4 shots from the Glock, which was extremely loud, and my son Niels then started to cry. He was really upset. I was had the feeling, this thing is a deadly weapon, if anything. And that was it. That was the last time that I fired a weapon, and that was just with this guy who I knew who carried it. I guess those were the days in Latvia when, if you were a business person, you probably were armed for good reason. But and then, of course, I've shot an air rifle when I was a kid. When I was living in Newton, Massachusetts, we used to shoot an air rifle in the basement at paper targets and cans and stuff like that. So that was that. So those accusations are absolutely distorted, wrong, and the product of fever extreme brains here in Latvia. I have never served in the military. I have very little knowledge of what somebody gave me an automatic rifle, I really wouldn't know what to do with it. I have a vague idea where the trigger is and the muzzle and all that stuff. But anyway, then, moving along, that does not mean that I don't have a certain kind of analytic viewpoint on violence. And now violence, unfortunately, is part of almost all social change. I mean, historically, this is the case. You do not get serious social change unless at some point, and often irrationally, and often, with a wrong people or institutions being the brunt of the violence, that there is some kind of a violent reaction. And the violent reaction is violence against the institutional and structural violence of the system you are trying to change, such as here in Latvia, for instance, the system of serfdom and the domination of the country by the German barons and the Russian Tsar, which led to the 1905 revolution, in which there was quite a bit of violence. There were manorial manors burned to the ground. Some of these places were of great cultural value, and they should not have been sacked and burned, but they were. And then as the whole 1905 thing started to peter out, the institutional violence came back in the form of these punitive expeditions of Russian Cossacks who sort of lined people up and shot them, on the mere suspicion that it had something to do with the rebellion. Well, never mind that. And there were also peasant rebellions, serf rebellions in Latvia earlier than that. And the reason was not that they were doing it as a form of fun or recreation, but because these people were rebelling against economic and social exploitation and repression. And that is what happens. I mean, you cannot get away from that. I think it was Martin Luther King who said that a riot was the language of the powerless and voiceless, or something along those lines. Which is not to say that, I'm for riots or against riots. They happen, and they happen for sociologically valid, quote unquote, reasons. I mean, there was even a revolt here in Latvia in 2009 when people were sort of fed up with what was going on, the burgeoning economic crisis, the credit crunch, and all of that. And people went and they stoned the Latvian Parliament building and smashed windows all over the old town here and there. So, it's not. It is not. It is part and parcel of social change. Never mind the violence that we have seen in the U.S. Recently. Again, some of it triggered by police brutality toward demonstrators, and earlier before that, police brutality toward black people. I mean, this is what the whole thing was all about. Never mind what happened in the 60s. Never mind what happened in Chicago during the Democratic Convention. An action that was described as a police riot against largely peaceful demonstrators. Although, there were people there who were also ready to go and smash things and fight in the streets. But they also had their motivation and reason for doing so. So it's simply something that one has to accept as part of social change, that there may be outbursts of violence, that these outbursts of violence may be irrational, and that they may be even aimed at, objects, or in the worst case, people that had nothing to do with it. Yeah, so with the underlying issue. But and then there was this other thing, that all of this, this some of the youth protest activities here in Latvia to support the Black Lives Matter movement, that all of this is somehow inspired by evil Marxists. Well, there hasn't been a communist party in this country for roughly 30 years, aside from a few crackpot and fringe people that you might run across here and there. And the other thing is that all of the atrocities, and there were such, of course, the Soviet Union, China, Cambodia, everything that can be attributed to sort of Marxist revolutions or Marxist parties, all of this happened when Marx was already dead for decades. Uh, and what Marx did, and as one of the founders of modern sociology, is they simply looked at data and said that the data show me, the economic data, that there is a stratification of society by class, or you can call it class. There are those who have more political and economic power, and those who have less political and economic power. And at some point, these contradictions of political and economic power in a society can lead to certain stresses, strains, and even uprisings, which is to some extent proven true historically. Which is not to say that the entire Marxist agenda is something that is right and that is 100% supportable, but this is what, again, the alt right in Latvia believes. Yeah, that anyone who is part of the kind of social justice movement of any sort here in Latvia is all for bringing in a dictatorship and a command economy and no political parties and no market economy and everything like that. This is not absolutely ridiculous. At worst, quote unquote, what these people want is to have a kind of Scandinavian style social democracy where you have a market economy, where you have certain basics such as healthcare, education, and a basic level of subsistence guaranteed for everybody through the tax system and through other means. You just have to look at the way countries like Sweden and Finland and Norway, Denmark, even to some extent Canada and New Zealand function, and that's what people are looking to. Again, maybe with some greater or lesser accent on the green side of things, on whether one should emphasize change the economy to use less fossil fuels or whatever. That's all that is all about. And the fact that young people here are in solidarity with Black Lives Matter simply means that these people are aware of what's going on in the world. They're part of this global, interconnected youth who are aware of global issues, and racism is a global issue. I mean, that's undeniable. And at the same time, it should be noted that this same youth organization that is now demonized on Latvian social media by some people also protested against the conditions in Belarus, which has been called Europe's last dictatorship, and against the new constitutional reforms in Russia on the day that the vote took place. So these people are hardly supporters of authoritarianism or any of this other bad stuff. And of course, they are they are also fighting climate change, and they are also very, very much for LGBT rights, which sort of is par for the course for any sort of young, educated, socially aware young person in the world. Whether you like it or not, that's gonna happen. Basically, so that was what my whole thing about in Latvian was about yesterday, more or less, as well as I can sort of piece it together again here for you guys in English. So anyway, this is Juris Kaja in Riga signing off. Have a good day or whatever, wherever you are.